India will take all necessary measures to safeguard its national interests and economic security. In the face of Trump's tariff hammer, most of the world's countries, unwilling to lose access to the world's largest market, chose to curry favor with the United States. In the climate of escalating US-China competition, the best way to prove one's loyalty to Washington was undoubtedly to sabotage relations with Beijing. Many ASEAN and EU nations, even those with historically good ties to China, made this choice. But India, a longtime rival of China, did the exact opposite. Not only did it refuse to damage its cooperation with China to please the US, but it actually strengthened its ties with Beijing at this critical moment. This move caught many by surprise, but for anyone who understands India, it makes perfect sense. It's not just that India's inflated national pride won't allow its government to sell out its own interests to appease America. It's that Made in India is so deeply intertwined with China that the country simply cannot afford the cost of decoupling. Ironically, the Make in India initiative was originally conceived as a plan to move away from China. When China became the world's second-largest economy and top industrial nation in 2010, America's hegemonic instincts sensed a threat. U.S. policy quickly shifted from cooperation to confrontation. However, the deep trade ties between the two countries severely limited America's options. To more effectively suppress China, the U.S. was desperate to break its dependency on Made in China. But America's own economy had long been deindustrialized and hollowed out. Reviving manufacturing at home would mean starting from scratch, facing a shortage of skilled labor, aging infrastructure, and a broken supply chain. Even if a company could overcome these hurdles and produce a quality product, the cost would be so astronomical that it would be unmarketable. Knowing this, the U.S. turned its attention to the developing world, looking for countries that could replace China on the production side. India seized this opportunity, launching its Make in India campaign. In a September 2014 speech, Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowed to transform India into the new global manufacturing hub. While India was far from the only country vying to replace China, it was an attractive candidate. Unlike Southeast Asian nations that are heavily influenced by Chinese culture and lie within its sphere of influence, or Latin American countries whose rise could challenge U.S. control in its own backyard, India was geographically isolated and already viewed China as a hypothetical enemy. Shifting manufacturing there was undoubtedly a better fit for American interests. With the U.S. government's blessing, Western capital began pouring into India, and Western companies started trying to move their production lines from China. However, after getting battered by India's terrible infrastructure, unskilled workforce, and fickle government policies that always seemed to demand the upper hand, most foreign investors eventually fled. A decade after the Make in India plan was launched, the manufacturing sector's share of India's GDP had actually decreased. Still, thanks to the massive influx of Western investment, India's overall economy grew rapidly. It would be unfair to say Make in India was a total failure. In fact, India made significant strides in several key manufacturing sectors, including electronics and vehicles, and its export numbers have been climbing steadily. However, this progress is nowhere near enough to challenge China's manufacturing dominance. In fact, it has only deepened India's dependence on China. The U.S. recognized this problem as early as 2023. That June, Bloomberg published an article titled, "Modi's Grand Make in India Goal is Being Realized in China," which used a toy manufacturer to illustrate the central paradox facing the initiative. The toy industry is a rare bright spot in Indian manufacturing. With strong government support, it has transformed from being import-reliant to mostly self-sufficient and even an exporter. But behind this success is a critical dependency. Indian toy makers need to import vast quantities of raw materials like electric motors, integrated circuits, and LEDs from China to complete production. In other words, the Made in India label was really just assembled in India. It created some competition with China at the final assembly stage, but did nothing to shake China's control over the overall supply chain. This was not what Western and Indian governments had hoped for, but Indian businesses had their reasons. Many of these components simply aren't produced in India, and even if they were, the price would be far higher than China's. Forcing the use of Indian-made components would render their final products completely uncompetitive. By contrast, the current model, despite its low rate of domestic sourcing, at least allows them to snatch some market share from China and build a global reputation for Made in India.
If this is true for a relatively low-tech industry like toys, it's even more pronounced in sectors like electronics and machinery. Even the Indian government has had to admit that its manufacturing incentives are mostly being used by assembly companies, not true manufacturers. In this context, India's export growth is no longer evidence of its manufacturing strength because, as exports surge, so does its reliance on imported Chinese parts and materials. Even in the assembly process, India can't escape its dependence. In any industry with even a moderate level of technical skill, Indian companies rely on Chinese technicians to keep their operations running. After the 2020 Galwan Valley border clash, India tightened visas for Chinese personnel. Before Beijing could even respond, Indian companies were the first to cry foul,
complaining that if Chinese engineers couldn't arrive on time, their production would suffer. The government didn't change its policy, but the outcry itself was a telling signal. Since its founding, India has viewed China as a rival, and anti-China sentiment has always been a key tool for boosting national unity and gaining leverage on the world stage. The anti-China rhetoric in Indian domestic media is even more intense than in the West. In such an environment, it's rare for an Indian to have a positive view of China, and anyone who speaks favorably of the country is often attacked. Yet Indian companies are willing to brave this fierce domestic backlash to maintain their relationship with China, revealing the true depth of their dependency. While the Indian government has tried to decouple, its efforts have been largely ineffective. Their progress in developing domestic alternatives can't even keep pace with the deepening dependency caused by the expansion of Make in India. The old adage holds true: the economic base determines the superstructure. When the lifeline of India's economic development is in China's hands, even a government as famously proud as India's finds it hard to maintain a staunchly anti-China stance. This was especially true after the 2019 air skirmish with Pakistan, when India's military weakness could no longer be hidden by propaganda. The West lost faith in India's ability to act as a counterweight to China. After all, no one believes that an army that can't decisively beat Pakistan could possibly gain an advantage against the much larger, better supplied, and more technologically advanced People's Liberation Army. America's past tolerance for India's behavior was largely based on its strategic value against China. Now that this value was proven to be a propaganda-fueled illusion, the U.S. was no longer willing to let India get a free pass. In a sharp reversal, the U.S. began slapping heavy tariffs on India, using its import of Russian oil as a pretext. India ended up facing some of the highest tariffs on its products under the Trump administration. Meanwhile, as a nation that relies on populism to maintain unity, the Indian government could not admit failure to its people. But the reality of their military performance forced them to back down, raising public suspicion. If India won such a great victory at the front, people asked, why not press the advantage and achieve the pre-war objectives? At the very least, Pakistan should be made to apologize and pay reparations. At that moment, the Indian government was desperate for a new headline to distract the public and project an image of strength. Just then, the global tariff war initiated by the U.S. reached India's shores, and New Delhi saw its chance. Countering the U.S. was a perfect way to demonstrate India's strength. Seeing China's success in pushing back gave India the impression that America's tariffs were just a bluff. Besides, the bargaining chips India could offer the U.S., stopping Russian oil imports, reducing trade with China, and lowering its own tariffs, were all politically toxic for the Modi government. Reselling Russian oil was a massive source of profit, much of it going to Modi's allies. Chinese raw materials were the cornerstone of Indian manufacturing, and tariff protections were a matter of life and death for Indian farmers, and by extension, Modi's votes. Furthermore, given the extreme national pride among the Indian populace, the public would never accept their government bowing down to another country, even if the concessions caused little actual harm. So,
In the aftermath of the Pakistan conflict, India's stance towards the U.S. hardened. But India's national strength is nowhere near sufficient to confront two great powers like the U.S. and China simultaneously. It relies on external support to even contend with one. In the past, India could stir up trouble on the Chinese border knowing it had American backing. Now that the U.S. was an adversary, India could no longer afford to antagonize China. And so, in recent months, we've seen India repeatedly send friendly signals to China, from restoring visas to the Prime Minister attending a conference in Beijing, a complete reversal from its previous anti-China stance. But given India's circumstances, its choice is not surprising. After all, for all its challenges, India is still a major independent power.